Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in Australia, afternoon in Canada, or evening in Miami, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. I remember the smell first. Damp earth, lilacs wilting on the coffin, and that strange sweetness of rain that comes before a storm. Thomas always said he wanted a simple service, but even the heavens seemed to protest that morning. The chapel bell tolled slow and heavy, echoing off the old stones that had seen too many goodbyes. I stood there in black, clutching my handkerchief like it could keep me from falling apart. My children were around me, whispering condolences to strangers, but their voices sounded far away, like I was underwater. When they lowered him into the ground, I thought I had buried 52 years of my life with him. I thought I knew the man inside that coffin. But as the first handful of dirt hit the lid, something inside me whispered, "You don't know everything, Eleanor." After the service, people began to leave, slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid to be the first to turn their backs on the dead. I lingered, staring at the carved letters on his stone. Thomas Whitmore, beloved husband and father. Beloved. The word caught in my throat like a lie too heavy to swallow. That's when I saw her, standing under the crooked oak near the edge of the cemetery. A young woman, maybe in her 30s, with a black veil and a child holding her hand. I thought she must have wandered to the wrong grave, but her eyes never left mine. There was something haunting in them, something familiar. The little boy beside her clutched a single white rose and hid behind her skirt. When she finally walked toward me, my heart started to pound. Grief makes the mind see ghosts, I told myself. But she wasn't a ghost. She was real, and she knew my husband. She stopped a few feet from me, voice trembling. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, barely more than a whisper. I nodded, though my throat had gone dry. Her gloved hands shook as she knelt and placed the white rose on Thomas's grave. "I'm sorry for your loss," she murmured. Then she looked at me with a kind of fragile guilt I couldn't place. "He was a good man," she added. "He was my whole world once," I almost said, but the words never came. Instead, I asked, "Did you know my husband?" Her answer came with eyes full of apology. "Yes, ma'am, more than I should have." My heart stopped. The wind picked up then, cold and sharp, lifting the veil from her face. I saw it, the same gray eyes Thomas had. And when the little boy peeked from behind her dress, I saw those same eyes again, staring up at me, confused and innocent. For a long moment I couldn't breathe. The world tilted, and the chapel bell sounded far away again. I wanted to scream, to deny it, to demand she explain, but I just stood there, frozen. My hands trembled so badly I had to hold onto the iron fence beside me. The woman's lips quivered. "He never meant to hurt you," she said softly. "He just didn't know how to let go." Her words fell like stones. I looked at the boy, no older than 8, and something inside me broke in two. The child shifted nervously, hiding half his face behind the rose stem. "He told me to come," the woman whispered. "Before he passed, he said I should find you, that you deserve to know." Rain began to fall, light and steady, tracing cold lines down my cheeks. But it wasn't the rain that stung. It was the realization that Thomas had lived another life right under my nose. I remember whispering his name, Thomas, as if it could summon him back to explain himself. The woman started to cry then, real tears, unhidden and raw. "He loved you," she said, "but he loved us too." I don't know what hurt more, the betrayal or the honesty of it. I turned away, afraid she'd see me crumble. My children were already gone by then, the cars pulling away through the muddy path. No one saw the moment my world shifted forever. I stood there between two graves, my husband's and the future I thought I'd had, and felt the truth settle like frost in my bones. When I finally spoke, my voice didn't sound like my own. "Leave," I told her quietly. "Take the boy and go." She hesitated, nodding once before turning away. But as she walked off through the mist, I saw the boy look back, his gray eyes meeting mine, and for the briefest moment, I wondered if Thomas's ghost lingered in him. That night, the rain refused to stop. It pattered against the window like impatient fingers, and I sat in the quiet parlor with only the clock ticking on the wall to remind me time was still moving. My black dress clung to me, damp from the cemetery, but I hadn't the strength to change. Every sound in that house carried Thomas's ghost. The creak of the stairs, the hum of the old heater, even the scent of his tobacco lingering in the air. I replayed that woman's face over and over, the gray-eyed boy, the way her voice broke when she said, "He loved you too." It gnawed at me, made me question every Sunday dinner, every smile across the breakfast table. Who was I married to all those years? I thought I'd buried a husband, but it felt like I'd buried a stranger. When the clock struck midnight, I finally rose to make some tea, needing something warm to keep from falling apart entirely. That's when I saw it, a cream-colored envelope, tucked behind the framed photo of our wedding day. The handwriting on it was unmistakable, Thomas's neat, deliberate script. "For Eleanor," it said, and below that a single word, "Forgive." My heart stopped. My fingers trembled as I pulled it free, afraid to open it, afraid of what waited inside. The edges were yellowed, as though he'd written it long before the sickness took him. I sat down at the kitchen table, the old lamp casting a dim circle of light, and just stared at it for what felt like forever. How long had it been sitting there, waiting for me? How many times had I dusted that frame, never knowing the truth was right behind it? Finally, I tore it open. Inside were 3 pages, written in his careful hand. The first line read, "If you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage I couldn't while I was alive." I had to close my eyes for a moment, steadying my breath before I went on. He began with memories, how we met at that church social when I was only 20, how nervous he'd been asking me to dance. "You were always the better soul between us," he wrote, "and I failed you in ways I can never make right." My eyes blurred as I read, his voice echoing in my mind like a ghost reading over my shoulder. Then came the words I dreaded. There was someone else. He didn't name her at first. He only said it happened during a time when we were both lost, when I was caring for my sick mother and he was away for work in Detroit. "I was weak, Ellie," he wrote, using the nickname I hadn't heard in years. "She was kind to me when I was lonely. I never planned for it to last, but one mistake became a life I couldn't undo." My hand went to my chest, as if pressing against the wound could stop it from bleeding. He went on to say her name, Clara. He said she wasn't some stranger. She'd worked at the very chapel where we'd renewed our vows 20 years ago. "She gave birth to a boy," he wrote, and though I never brought him into our home, I couldn't turn my back on him. I helped where I could, quietly, foolishly, and I prayed every day that you'd never have to know. I stared at those words, tears running down my face, blurring the ink until it bled into the paper. So every business trip, every unexplained absence, those weren't just errands. Those were visits. Visits to a son I never knew existed. "He looks like you in the eyes," Thomas wrote. "Gentle, full of forgiveness I don't deserve." That line broke me. Forgiveness. He'd used that word as though he believed I could give it freely. But how do you forgive a ghost for living 2 lives under one roof? The last page was shorter, shakier, his handwriting unsteady from the illness that had weakened him. "By the time you find this, I'll be gone. I know I took more than I gave, but I hope one day, when the anger quiets, you'll remember the man who loved you enough to be afraid of losing you." I folded the letter with trembling hands, pressing it against my chest like a relic of a faith I'd lost. Outside, the storm had quieted to a soft drizzle, and through the rain-streaked window, I could see the faint outline of the chapel on the hill where we'd buried him that morning. I whispered into the dark, "You coward." My voice cracked, but the truth was heavier than the anger, because even in betrayal I still missed him. I still loved him. I just didn't know if that love would ever mean the same again. I didn't sleep that night. The letter sat on the table beside me, edges curling from the candle's warmth, its words carved into my mind like gravestones I couldn't look away from. Every hour that passed, I read it again, hoping the words might change, hoping he'd say it was all a misunderstanding. But they didn't change, and morning came like a punishment. The rain had stopped, yet the sky still carried the color of morning. I moved slowly through the house, every creak of the floorboard reminding me of how empty it felt now. That was when the knock came. 3 soft raps on the front door, hesitant, like someone uncertain they were welcome. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But when I opened the door, there she was. Clara. She stood on my porch, pale from the cold, her hands clasped tightly around her purse. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, voice trembling. I know this isn't the right time, but please may I come in? I should have said no. Every fiber in my body screamed to shut the door, to keep her and all she represented outside. But something in her eyes, the same sorrow I'd seen at the cemetery, made me step aside. She walked in quietly, glancing around as if the walls themselves might judge her. The house smelled of old roses and rain-damp wood. I gestured toward the parlor, and she sat on the edge of the armchair like a schoolgirl caught in confession. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt like a wound that couldn't close. Finally, she whispered, He told me you'd find the letter. I didn't come to defend him. I wanted you to know I never meant for any of this to happen. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I could see how fear had carved its own home behind her eyes. He loved you, she added softly. He never stopped. I almost laughed, a broken sound that wasn't quite laughter at all. You loved him too, I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Her face went pale. Yes, she admitted, but not the way you think. He came to me when he was lonely. I was young, foolish. I thought I could make him happy. She looked down, twisting her gloves and hands. By the time I realized what it meant, I was carrying his child. I closed my eyes, the words hitting like cold wind. Did you ever think of me? I asked. She nodded, tears spilling now. Every day. I prayed for forgiveness I didn't deserve. He told me about you. How kind you were, how patient. He said losing you would kill him. The bitterness rose in me like bile. And yet he risked it anyway. Clara didn't answer. She just sat there, trembling. For the first time, I saw her not as a villain, but as another woman caught in the same web of his weakness. We were both victims of his love and his lies. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small wooden box. He wanted you to have this, she said. I hesitated, staring at it. The box was smooth, carved with a cross on the lid, the kind Thomas used to make in his workshop. I opened it slowly. Inside was a silver locket I hadn't seen in decades, the very one I'd lost after our 25th anniversary. My breath caught. Inside the locket was our wedding photo on one side, and on the other a tiny picture of the boy, smiling, holding a toy car. I felt the room spin. He kept this. I whispered. He carried it every day, Clara said, her voice breaking. He said it reminded him of the life he couldn't fix. My heart twisted painfully. The locket was warm in my palm, like it had been waiting all these years to tell me the truth. I didn't know whether to cherish it or throw it into the fire. When Clara stood to leave, the house felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I didn't come for forgiveness, she said softly at the door. I just wanted you to know the truth, from me, not from his ghosts. I nodded, unable to speak. Her eyes lingered on mine, full of sorrow and something almost like gratitude. Then she turned and walked down the path toward the chapel road, her figure shrinking into the mist. I stood there until she vanished from sight, the locket still clutched in my hand. Somewhere deep inside me, grief tangled with something else, pity, maybe even understanding. I looked at the empty chair where she'd sat, and for the first time since Thomas's death, I whispered into the silence, "You should have told me, Thomas." I could have borne the truth better than the lie. But the house gave no answer, only the ticking of the clock, steady and unforgiving. The days after Clara's visit passed like a fog that refused to lift. I moved through the house on autopilot, dusting the same shelves, making tea I never drank, setting 2 plates out of habit instead of 1. The locket stayed on the mantel, gleaming faintly in the afternoon light, as if it was watching me. I tried to pray, but every time I closed my eyes, all I saw was Thomas holding that child, smiling the way he once smiled at our own. One morning, as the chapel bells tolled in the distance, a sound broke my quiet, knocking, light and uncertain at the front door. I hesitated, my heart quickening. When I opened it, there he stood, the boy from the funeral. The same gray eyes, the same uncertain hands. Clara wasn't with him. He held a small toy car in one hand, the same one from the locket photo. "Ma'am," he said shyly, "are you Mrs. Whitmore?" My voice caught. Yes, I am." He smiled, small and careful. "My mama said I could come say thank you for letting us say goodbye." He stood there in his little wool coat, hair damp from the morning mist, a nervous energy radiating from him. I didn't know what to say. My first instinct was to send him away, to protect the fragile walls of my grief. But something in his eyes, so full of innocence, and something painfully familiar, made me step aside. "Would you like some cocoa?" I asked softly. He nodded, and soon he was sitting at my kitchen table, legs too short to reach the floor, his fingers tracing the edge of his mug. "Mama said my papa was a good man," he said quietly. I froze, the word papa hitting me like a stone. He used to bring me these little wooden toys. He said he made them himself. He pulled one from his coat pocket, a tiny bird carved from maple. My breath hitched. Thomas had carved that same bird for our daughter when she was 5. "He did make them," I whispered. "He made hundreds." The boy's smile grew. He said I should give you one someday. The moment he placed the carving in my hand, I felt my throat close. The wood was smooth, familiar, the same craftsmanship, the same care. I turned it over and saw Thomas's initials burned faintly into the bottom. The boy looked up at me expectantly, his small face open and full of light. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to see him as proof of betrayal, but all I saw was a child who had done nothing wrong. "Do you miss him?" he asked softly. The question startled me. "Every day," I whispered. He nodded solemnly, as if he understood grief better than any child should. "Mama cries sometimes," he said, "but she says you're very strong." That made me laugh a little, a broken, trembling sound. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, "strength isn't what you think it is." I reached across the table, my hand trembling as it touched his. His small fingers curled around mine, warm and steady. "Papa said you had kind hands," he murmured. We sat like that for a long while, the ticking clock marking every fragile second. The cocoa went cold, but neither of us moved. I studied his face, the curve of his chin, the faint dimple on his left cheek, and my heart ached with the realization of how much of Thomas lived on in him. When he finally looked up, he asked, "Can I see where he's sleeping?" It took me a moment to understand. "You mean his grave?" He nodded. So I put on my coat, and together we walked the muddy path toward the chapel cemetery. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp stone. The boy held my hand tightly, his small fingers gripping mine like he was afraid the world might swallow him whole. When we reached the grave, he knelt beside it and placed the little wooden bird on top. "Papa said birds don't cry," he said softly. "They just keep singing." I felt something inside me break open then, not from pain, but from something deeper, maybe forgiveness beginning to bloom. As we stood there, a shaft of sunlight pierced through the gray clouds, warming the headstone. The boy turned to me, smiling shyly. "Mama says we might move away soon," he said. "She says the town is too sad." My heart twisted. "Wherever you go," I whispered, "your father's love will follow." He looked at me curiously. "Will you miss us?" he asked. The question startled tears I didn't know I had left. "I already do," I said softly. He reached up then and hugged me. Quick, awkward, but full of a child's pure affection. When he pulled away, he said, "Mama says you're brave." I smiled faintly. "Tell her she's wrong. I'm just tired." As he walked back down the path, the sunlight caught in his hair, and for a fleeting moment, I saw Thomas's shadow walking beside him. The grief didn't vanish, but for the first time, it didn't feel like drowning. It felt like remembering how to breathe again. The boy's visit lingered in my heart long after he left. The house didn't feel as heavy that evening. The silence, though still vast, no longer hurt quite the same way. I sat by the window as dusk bled across the sky, watching the chapel lights flicker to life in the distance. Somewhere beyond those walls, his mother was probably tucking him into bed, telling him stories to keep his father alive in memory. And here I was, holding the ghost of that same man between my trembling hands. I turned the wooden bird over and over, tracing the initials carved at the base. For the first time, I wondered if forgiveness wasn't something I had to give, but something I had to let happen on its own. When I finally rose, I went to the parlor to dust the mantel again, something I'd done every day since the funeral. But as I reached to adjust the old family clock, the corner of a folded paper, yellowed and brittle, caught my eye behind the frame. My breath stopped. Another secret. The paper was an old photograph, black and white, edges curled and cracked with time. I held it under the lamp, and the image came into view. Thomas, younger, standing beside Clara in front of a small house I didn't recognize. Between them, a baby, wrapped in a knitted blanket I had made years ago for our first grandson. My knees almost gave out. That blanket had gone missing one winter, and Thomas had told me he'd misplaced it at church. But now I saw the truth. He'd taken it to wrap another child, his other son. The picture told stories words never could. Thomas's arm around Clara's shoulders, the tenderness in his eyes, the quiet joy in that moment. My stomach twisted. That wasn't a man caught in guilt. That was a man in love. I sank into the chair, clutching the photograph to my chest, and whispered to the empty room. "How many lies did you build this life upon, Thomas?" The wind outside rattled the windows as if the house itself was answering. I thought of burning it, of lighting a match and watching the truth curl into ash. But something in me couldn't. Maybe because even lies, once spoken or seen, deserve their own kind of burial. So instead, I opened the locket on the mantel and slipped the photograph inside, folding it small enough to fit behind the tiny wedding picture. It felt right somehow to let both halves of his life rest side by side, the man he was to me and the man he was to her. As I closed the locket, I felt an odd calm settle over me. Grief changes shape in strange ways. It stops screaming and starts whispering. It teaches you to hold pain without letting it destroy you. I sat there for a long time, staring into the dying fire, thinking of the choices that shape us, the silences that define us. Somewhere deep inside, I began to realize that maybe Thomas hadn't meant to betray love. He'd simply been too weak to face it fully. The next morning, I took a walk to the cemetery. The grass was still wet from dew, and a thin veil of fog curled around the tombstones like ghosts refusing to leave. I brought fresh lilies, his favorite, and laid them by the grave. "You're still lying to me, even from down there," I whispered, but my tone carried more exhaustion than anger. I placed the locket on the stone, letting it rest there for a moment. The cold metal gleamed against the granite, catching the pale morning light. "You loved two families," I said softly, "and maybe in your broken way, you thought that was love enough." I traced the letters of his name, my fingers trembling. But love isn't about halves, Thomas. It's about truth. I didn't expect an answer, but as the chapel bell began to toll in the distance, the wind stirred just enough to lift a single lily petal into the air. It drifted upward, light as forgiveness. When I returned home, I placed the locket inside my jewelry box. next to my wedding ring, which I had taken off after the funeral and never worn again. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I couldn't wear it either. It belonged to a different woman, a version of me who still believed love could be trusted. I sat at my dressing table and looked into the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked older than she had a week ago, yet her eyes were steadier. I realized then that grief had stripped me of illusions, but it hadn't stripped me of strength. I picked up my journal and began to write for the first time in years. I wrote everything, the affair, the child, the letter, the visit, the photograph. Each word felt like setting down a stone I'd been carrying too long. When I finished, I closed the journal and whispered, "Maybe this is how I forgive you." A week passed after I found that photograph, though the days felt slower than winter mornings. Every tick of the clock seemed to echo his name. I had begun to accept that Thomas's secrets were his burden, not mine to carry anymore. But secrets have a strange way of living on, like roots under soil, still growing even when the tree has been cut down. That morning, I decided to go into town. I hadn't stepped beyond the chapel hill since the funeral. The bakery's bell chimed as I entered, and the warm scent of bread wrapped around me. Mrs. Alder, the baker's wife, looked up from the counter. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she managed a polite nod. "Eleanor, it's good to see you out." Her voice trembled, the way it does when someone knows something they shouldn't. I smiled faintly, thanked her, and bought a loaf I didn't need. As I turned to leave, I heard two women near the window whispering. I didn't catch every word, but I heard enough. "The boy looks just like him." The words clung to me all the way home, cold as rain on the back of my neck. I told myself I was imagining things people always talk after a funeral, filling silence with gossip. But in my heart, I knew it wasn't imagination. The boy had been seen before. Perhaps they had all known, or at least suspected, while I stood in church pews beside Thomas, smiling through decades of unspoken things. The thought stung more than any betrayal. I had been the last to know in my own story. When I reached the chapel gates, Reverend Matthews was locking up after the morning service. He looked startled to see me. "Eleanor," he said, fumbling with the keys, "you're looking well." I watched his eyes dart away, nervous. "Reverend," I said softly, "how long have you known?" He froze, the answer hanging in the air between us like fog. "Some truths," he murmured finally, "are not ours to speak." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me with the kind of silence that shatters more than words ever could. That night I couldn't sleep. The rain came again, gentle but relentless, tapping the roof like the steady rhythm of a conscience. I lit a single candle in the kitchen and opened my journal. The photograph was still pressed between the pages where I'd left it. I stared at the faces, Clara, Thomas, and that baby, wondering if anyone else in this town had ever seen it. My thoughts turned to Clara. What had her life been like? Did she walk through these same streets, hiding her eyes, carrying his child and his absence all at once? I tried to hate her, I truly did, but I couldn't. Love doesn't dissolve easily, even when it's misused. It lingers in the air like perfume on an old dress, faint but impossible to forget. I blew out the candle and whispered into the dark, "If anyone should be blamed, it's him, not her." My voice cracked on the last word. Outside, thunder rumbled like a distant reply. The following afternoon, I visited the chapel cemetery again, the one where Thomas rested beneath the oak. But this time, I wasn't there to mourn. I was there to listen. The caretaker, old Mr. Flynn, was trimming the hedges when I arrived. He gave me a small nod, his eyes gentle but cautious. "You know," he said quietly, "your Thomas used to come here late at night sometimes. Sat right there by the gate." I looked at the iron bench he pointed to. "Said he was praying," Mr. Flynn continued, "but once I heard him talking to someone, a woman's name, Clara, I think." My heart clenched. "Did you tell anyone?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "Didn't see my place. A man's sins are between him and his maker." I thanked him and turned away, my hands trembling as I gripped my shawl. The air smelled of wet earth and lilies, and for a fleeting second I thought I heard laughter in the wind, a child's, faint and distant. When I returned home, the sunset was bleeding through the windows in soft orange and violet. I sat in my rocking chair, listening to the creak of old wood beneath me. My heart felt heavy, but not with anger anymore, with understanding. The town's whispers, the Reverend's silence, Mr. Flynn's confession, they weren't cruelty, just the quiet way people protect what's fragile. Everyone had been trying to preserve the image of a good man, even if it meant burying the truth alongside him. I looked at Thomas's photograph on the mantel. "You were a coward," I said softly, "but you were human." My eyes stung with tears, though my voice stayed calm. And maybe that's all any of us are, flawed, frightened souls just trying to be loved. The wind rose outside, rattling the windows, and for a moment I thought I saw movement by the chapel, a figure standing among the graves. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just shadows and memory. Just me, still talking to ghosts. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly inside a brown envelope with no return address. My hands trembled as I turned it over, tracing the faint ink that had bled through the paper with age. It smelled faintly of lavender and dust, an old scent, one that carried memory. The handwriting was delicate, curved, unmistakably feminine. I sat by the window, the light spilling through lace curtains onto the table, and for a long moment I couldn't bring myself to open it. Something deep inside me already knew who it was from. The name Clara whispered through my mind like a forgotten song. I finally slit the envelope open, the paper crackling softly. The first line read, "If you're reading this, Eleanor, it means Thomas is gone." My breath caught. My eyes blurred as I continued to read her words. Apologies written in trembling ink. Explanations that twisted my heart in ways I never thought possible. Clara hadn't written to gloat or confess. She had written to make peace. "He never meant to hurt you," the letter said. "He loved you deeply in his way. But he loved our son too, and that love was a kind he didn't understand how to live with." My chest ached as I read those lines. There was no defensiveness in her tone, only sorrow. Clara explained that she had met Thomas before the war, when she was a nurse and he, a young builder repairing the chapel roof. They had fallen in love quietly, almost accidentally, in those days when the world was fragile and hope was rare. Then he married me. I could almost hear her sigh between the words. "He told me he couldn't undo what he'd promised you. But when our child came, he swore he'd find a way to provide without you ever knowing. He said you were too kind to deserve pain." My throat tightened. I set the letter down and stared out the window, watching the wind stir the tall grass. The world outside felt too calm for such truths. I picked up the second page, my tears falling in quiet drops onto the paper. "When our son Samuel was born," Clara wrote, "Thomas came to see him only once. He brought a tiny carved bird, said he made it from oak taken from the chapel pews. He cried that day, Eleanor, said he wished the world were different." I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling my heart throb beneath it. I remembered that carving, how Thomas used to sit by the fire whittling pieces of wood in silence. Once I'd asked who he made them for, and he'd said just for peace of mind. I thought he meant the hobby gave him calm. I never imagined the carvings were small apologies to a life he couldn't claim. Clara ended her letter with something that broke me in the gentlest way possible. "He asked me to promise that when he died, I'd let you know the truth. He didn't want you to think his love for you was false. He just couldn't live with the pieces of himself he'd hidden." By the time I reached the final line, I could hardly breathe. "Our son knows nothing of you," she wrote. "He grew up believing his father was a kind man who helped build the chapel. I never told him more. He's grown now, with children of his own. But I thought you deserved to know he exists, and that he carries Thomas's eyes." My tears fell freely then, soaking into the page, blurring the ink until her words became ghosts. I sat there for hours, holding that letter to my heart, feeling both shattered and strangely whole. Clara wasn't my enemy. She was the other half of a story I never knew I was living in. I closed my eyes and whispered her name like a prayer. The candle on the table flickered, casting gentle shadows on the walls, and I felt something shift inside me. Grief turning into quiet understanding. The love I had lost wasn't pure, but it was real, and maybe that was enough. That evening, I walked to the chapel once more. The air was cool, the sun sinking behind the willow trees, painting the cemetery in soft gold. I brought Clara's letter with me and placed it atop Thomas's grave. "You tried to protect me," I whispered, "but truth doesn't destroy love, it completes it." My voice trembled. "I forgive you, Thomas, and I forgive her, too." The wind stirred the leaves around me like gentle applause. For the first time since his passing, I felt peace, not the kind born from forgetting, but from finally understanding. As I turned to leave, a young man was standing near the gate, holding a bouquet of white lilies. He looked at me politely, nodded once, then walked toward the far end of the cemetery. Something in the curve of his jaw, the calm in his eyes, it made my heart skip. I watched him pass, a strange warmth blooming in my chest. I didn't ask who he was. Some part of me already knew. I saw him again 3 days later, the young man from the cemetery. I was tending to the small white roses near Thomas's headstone when I felt it, a presence, quiet but strong, standing a few paces behind me. "Ma'am." His voice was gentle, careful, like someone used to speaking softly around fragile things. I turned, and there he was, holding that same bouquet of lilies. The afternoon light touched his face, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. His eyes, they were his, Thomas's eyes, the same gray-blue hue that once watched me from across our kitchen table, the same way they softened when he laughed. "I'm sorry to bother you," the young man said, shifting his weight nervously. "I was just visiting someone. My grandmother used to bring me here when I was little." My throat tightened. "Who is she?" I asked. "Clara," he replied. The name hit me like a gust of cold wind. He smiled faintly. "She passed last year." My knees weakened. I gripped the bench to steady myself. The past had found its way to me, alive and breathing. We sat together on the bench by the old oak, the same one Thomas used to sit on when he came here at night. The young man, Samuel, he told me, spoke with a kindness that disarmed me completely. "My grandmother always said this chapel had the most peaceful silence," he said, looking around. "She used to tell me stories about a man she once loved, said he was brave but broken. I never knew his name, though." I looked at him, my heart a trembling thing in my chest. "And you never asked?" I whispered. He smiled, a little embarrassed. "She said some names belong to the wind, that if they're spoken too often, they lose their meaning." His words were so much like Thomas's it hurt. The way he tilted his head, the faint dimple when he smiled, it was as if Thomas had been reborn in front of me. For a while, we just sat there listening to the rustle of leaves. It was peaceful and unbearable all at once. I told him my name, Eleanor Whitmore, and something in his eyes changed. Recognition. Shock. "Whitmore," he repeated quietly. That was his name. My breath caught. "Whose?" I asked, though I already knew. He swallowed hard, glancing down at his hands. "My grandmother once showed me a picture of a man who looked a lot like you, actually. Said he built the chapel. Said he was my grandfather." The silence between us thickened like fog. I could feel the weight of decades pressing down, the invisible thread connecting us tightening until it almost hurt. I reached into my bag and took out the letter Clara had sent. "Your grandmother wrote this," I said softly. His eyes widened as he took it, holding it as if it were something sacred. "She wanted me to know," I continued, "and I think she wanted you to find peace too." His lips trembled. "I never knew," he said. "She never told me who he really was." Tears welled in his eyes. I thought he didn't care. He did, I whispered. He just didn't know how to show it. We sat for hours beneath that oak, two souls separated by generations, but bound by one man's choices. Samuel told me about his life. He was a teacher, married, 2 daughters. They love stories, he said with a laugh. Maybe it runs in the blood. I smiled faintly. It does, I said. Your grandfather used to tell our children bedtime tales about stars that could hear prayers. Samuel's eyes glistened. I used to dream about him, he confessed. Didn't know his face, but I felt him, like someone watching from far away. I nodded slowly, the ache in my chest softer now. He was watching, I said. In his own broken way, he never stopped. The chapel bell tolled in the distance, echoing through the trees. We both looked toward it, neither speaking. There was a peace in that sound, a closing of something that had long remained open. Before he left, Samuel stood and looked at Thomas's grave. He placed the bouquet of lilies on the stone, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, he said. I didn't ask what he was thanking him for, forgiveness, maybe, or life itself. When he turned back to me, I saw a reflection of both pain and healing in his face. Would it be all right, he asked hesitantly, if I visited you sometime? My eyes filled. I'd like that very much, I said. As he walked away down the gravel path, the evening light caught his figure, turning him into a silhouette of memory and hope. The wind carried the faint scent of lilies and rain. I stood there alone but not lonely, the quiet chapel behind me, the truth finally breathing in the open air. For the first time in my life, I felt Thomas's love, not in his lies or his touch, but in what he left behind. The night after meeting Samuel, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those gray-blue eyes, Thomas's eyes, looking at me from another face, one untouched by guilt or deceit. The storm came just before midnight, the kind that makes the world tremble. I lit a candle and wrapped my shawl tight. The chapel bell tolled once, though no one was there to pull the rope. Maybe the wind, maybe something else. I don't know what pulled me from the house that night, but my feet carried me up the hill toward the chapel. The rain stung my cheeks as I climbed the stone steps, clutching Clara's letter in one hand and the carved wooden bird Thomas once made in the other. Inside, the air smelled of wet stone and candle wax. I stood before the altar, trembling, my reflection flickering in the brass cross. Thomas, I whispered into the silence, I have something to say to you. My voice echoed through the empty pews like a ghost coming home. I loved you, I said aloud, my voice breaking. I loved you even when you were unkind, even when you vanished into your work and came home smelling of someone else's perfume. The sound of my confession filled the chapel, sharp as thunder. But I was a coward too, wasn't I? I pressed a hand against my chest. I saw the signs. I knew something wasn't right. I told myself it was my imagination because I was afraid of being alone. My tears blurred the candlelight until everything shimmered like a dream. I let your silence become my comfort, I continued, because it was easier than truth. I looked up at the ceiling beams, dark and ancient, the same ones Thomas had repaired all those years ago when he met Clara. We built this life together on secrets, I whispered, and both of us chose to look away. Lightning flashed through the stained glass window, bathing the chapel in red and gold. The truth was not cruel anymore. It was freeing. I walked toward the bell tower, the sound of rain echoing like applause on the roof. The heavy door creaked as I opened it, the wooden stairs spiraling upward into darkness. I climbed slowly, my hand brushing the rough stone wall for balance. Each step felt like a heartbeat, steady, deliberate. When I reached the top, the wind howled through the slats, carrying the scent of rain and earth. I could see the whole cemetery below, the gravestones glistening, the oak swaying, the chapel lights flickering like stars. You can rest now, I said softly into the night. Your secret is no longer yours alone. The carved bird felt warm in my palm, though it was only wood. I placed it beside the bell, a symbol of all he'd hidden and all I'd found. Then I knelt and prayed, not for him, but for myself. For forgiveness, for strength, for peace. The bell swayed gently in the wind, ringing once, low and sorrowful, yet somehow kind. As I descended the stairs, I felt lighter, though my body trembled from cold and tears. When I reached the chapel floor again, I noticed something lying near the altar, a folded piece of paper, old and yellowed. I picked it up carefully, the edges soft with time. The handwriting was Thomas's. My breath caught as I read, "If you ever find this, Ellie, know that I loved you first. I was a fool. I thought I could separate the two halves of my life, but I only broke both. I never wanted to hurt you. You were my home." The paper slipped from my fingers as I cried, but it wasn't the same kind of crying anymore. These tears felt like release. I whispered into the quiet, "I forgive you, Thomas, and I forgive myself." The storm outside began to calm, the rain softening into mist. The chapel smelled of earth and candle smoke, and for the first time in years I didn't feel haunted. When dawn finally came, light spilled through the stained glass, bathing the pews in gentle color. I stood there, tired but alive, watching dust dance in the sunbeams. The world looked softer, as if grief had finally loosened its grip. I walked outside to the cemetery, my boots crunching on wet gravel. The air was cool and clean, the kind that carries promise. I looked at Thomas's grave, the lilies still fresh from Samuel's visit. "You've been heard," I whispered, "and so have I." The bell rang once more in the distance, though no one was there to pull it. Perhaps it was the wind again, or maybe after all these years he was finally answering me. I smiled through my tears. "Goodbye, my love," I said softly. Then I turned toward home, leaving the secrets, the guilt, and the ghosts behind me, walking into the morning light with a heart that no longer feared the truth. The morning after the storm, the world felt new. The sky was a pale blue wash of forgiveness, the kind that only comes after a night that's taken everything and left you bare. I made myself tea chamomile the way Thomas liked it, and sat by the window as the sun spilled over the chapel hill. For years, I had dreaded mornings like this, when silence filled every corner of the house. But that day the silence wasn't hollow. It was peace. I looked at the wooden bird on the table, the one I'd taken from the bell tower. Its wings were chipped, its surface worn smooth from years of being held. "You made it home," I whispered. A faint smile crossed my lips. For the first time, the ache in my chest wasn't pain anymore, it was memory. Soft, bittersweet, and alive. The clock ticked gently, and the house seemed to breathe with me. Later that morning, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Samuel stood there, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. Not lilies this time, but daisies and violets, bright and simple. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said shyly. "I was nearby and thought I'd stop by." My heart warmed. "You're never intruding," I told him. "Come in." He stepped inside, glancing around at the framed photographs, the books stacked on the hearth, the faded curtains that had seen too many winters. "It feels familiar," he murmured, "like a place I've been before." I smiled. "Maybe some part of you has." We sat at the kitchen table, 2 generations of one story, and I poured us tea. He looked down at his cup for a moment, then said softly, "My daughter's name is Eleanor." My breath caught. "She was named after you," he added. "Clara told me about the woman she once hurt, said she was the kindest soul she'd ever met." I didn't realize I was crying until Samuel reached across the table and gently took my hand. His touch was warm, steady, a kindness I hadn't felt in years. "She must have loved you very much," I whispered. He nodded. "She did, but she always said she never stopped respecting you. She called you his light." His words filled the quiet room like sunlight. For so long, I had thought of Clara as the shadow in my story, but now I saw her differently, not as the woman who stole something from me, but as the one who carried a part of him I never could. She was his truth, I said softly, and I was his peace. Samuel smiled. Maybe that's what he needed both of you for. I laughed through my tears, a small, trembling laugh that felt like healing. Maybe so, I said. Maybe so. Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain-soaked earth and blooming jasmine. After he left, I walked down the familiar path toward the chapel one last time. The ground was still damp, the morning air cool and sweet. Birds sang in the trees, their voices soft and bright. I stood before Thomas's grave and placed a single daisy on the stone. "Your son is kind," I whispered. "You'd be proud of him." I paused, letting the moment breathe. "And I think I'll be all right now." The breeze lifted the hem of my dress, the sunlight warming my face. I closed my eyes and listened to the rustle of leaves, to the steady hum of life continuing, to the faint, faraway toll of the bell. There was no bitterness left in me, no more questions. Only love, quiet, imperfect, enduring, the kind that survives even after truth has stripped it bare. I turned to leave, and for a brief second, I thought I felt his hand brush mine, warm, fleeting, and gone. That evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees, watching the sky turn from gold to violet. Fireflies danced over the garden, tiny lanterns flickering in the dusk. Somewhere beyond the hill, the chapel bell rang once, not in mourning, but in memory. I smiled. "Good night, Thomas," I whispered. "Good night, Clara. Good night, my story." The air was still, the world calm. Inside, Samuel's letter sat on my table, next to the wooden bird and a photograph of my family. 3 generations, one truth finally laid to rest. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet wrap around me like an old quilt. I wasn't just the widow of a man who'd kept a secret. I was the keeper of the truth he couldn't face and the peace he'd never found. As the stars began to appear, I closed my eyes and smiled. The story was over, but my heart was finally free. And that's my story. Some truths don't come to destroy us, they come to set us free. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments what lesson you'd take from Eleanor's story. And remember, secrets buried in silence still have roots that reach for the light.